He was a man who carried the weight of two lives on his shoulders, his own and his little boy's. Ever since his wife had passed away, his world had changed. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt empty. Every evening he would come home tired, with dust on his clothes and sweat dripping from his forehead, but there was no one to greet him at the door except his young son. The boy tried to smile, tried to be strong, but deep down he missed the softness of a mother's touch. The man could see it in his eyes. He could see it in the way the boy sometimes stared out the window at other families walking by, wondering what it would be like to have a complete home again. Life was not easy. Work was hard, food was never enough, and the nights were long. Still, the man did his best. He cooked, he cleaned, he told bedtime stories, and he tried to fill the space his wife had left behind. But no matter how much effort he put in, he knew something was missing. His boy needed love and warmth that he alone could not give. Every night when the boy was asleep, the man would sit quietly at the table with a candle burning low, staring at the walls. The silence in the house was so heavy it almost pressed against his chest. He often thought about how life had turned out for him. He was not a bad man. He worked hard, he kept his promises, but fate had taken from him something he could never replace. Then came a day that would change everything. It was not planned, not something he ever imagined. He had gone into town, just like any other day, to buy a few supplies, flour, salt, maybe a little cloth to mend his son's clothes. As he walked past the busy streets, he overheard voices. At first, he didn't pay attention, but then the words caught him by surprise. A group of men were talking about a woman who was being traded for a single coin. Just $1. He froze for a moment. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A human being, spoken about as if she were nothing more than an object. The men laughed and joked, but behind their words was a heavy truth. This woman had no choice, no freedom. She was being given away. The man turned to walk away, but something in his heart made him stop. He thought about his boy. He thought about the empty chair at their table, the silence in their home, and the longing in his son's eyes. Could this woman, whoever she was, be the answer to the emptiness that had haunted them for so long? But then another thought struck him. What if she was broken? What if she was bitter and angry? What if he brought her into his home and made life worse for his boy? The fear almost made him walk away, but his heart wouldn't let him. Finally, with hesitation, he stepped forward. He asked about the woman, and for the price of a single dollar, she was brought to him. When she appeared, his heart sank. Her head was covered with a rough sack, tied tightly so that no one could see her face. She stood silently, her hands clasped together, her shoulders stiff as if the world had been cruel to her. The man's son clung to his hand, hiding behind him, his eyes wide with fear and curiosity. The man looked at the figure standing in front of him, unsure of what he had done. He had spent the last dollar he could spare on a stranger whose face he had never even seen. As they walked back home, the man's mind was full of questions. Who was she? What had she been through? Would she bring trouble, or would she bring peace? His boy was too young to understand, but he too sensed that something unusual was about to unfold. That night, the woman sat quietly in the corner of their small home. The boy whispered to his father, asking why she wore a sack on her head. The man had no answer. He simply said, "Tomorrow we will see." He barely slept that night. The thought of what awaited under that sack filled him with both fear and hope. His life, his son's life, and maybe even hers. Everything could change in the moment it came off. And so the first night passed with silence heavier than ever before. 3 souls under one roof, each with a different kind of emptiness, waiting to see what tomorrow would reveal. The morning light crept in through the small cracks of the wooden walls, painting the room in soft shades of gold. The man woke up early, as he always did, to start the fire and boil water for the day. But this morning felt different. There was someone else in the house. He turned his eyes toward the corner, where the woman sat quietly, her head still covered with the sack. She hadn't moved much through the night. She was like a shadow, silent and still, waiting for something she couldn't name. His son was curled up on the small bed, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the weight hanging in the air. The man stared at her for a long time, his heart wrestling with questions. What had he done? Was this the right choice? He wanted to believe he had acted for his son's good, but doubt gnawed at him. He wondered if, in his loneliness and desperation, he had made a mistake. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to hide," he said softly. "Not here." The woman didn't answer. She sat frozen, her hands resting on her lap. The sack remained in place, hiding her face from the world. The man walked closer, his steps careful, as if approaching a wounded bird. His son stirred, rubbing his eyes, and whispered, "Papa, will we see her today?" The man gave a small nod. It was time. With slow, cautious movements, he reached for the knot at the base of the sack. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled at the rope, loosening it bit by bit. The room was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat, strong and fast in his chest. His son clutched his arm tightly, peeking with wide, curious eyes. The knot gave way, and the sack began to slip. For a moment, the man hesitated, almost afraid of what he might find. He took a breath, steadying himself, and gently pulled it off. The sack fell away, and the truth was revealed. The woman's face came into the light. She was young, younger than he expected, with tired eyes that held both fear and strength. Her skin was marked by hardship, but her features were soft, fragile in a way that stirred something deep inside him. She did not meet his gaze at first. Instead, her eyes lowered, heavy with shame, as though she had forgotten how to be seen as a person. The boy gasped quietly, not in fear, but in surprise. He whispered she looked sad. The man's heart ached at those words because they were true. Sadness clung to her like a heavy cloak. But beyond the sadness, he saw something else. He saw a quiet dignity, a silent courage that told him she was not broken. She was simply waiting for someone to treat her as human again. He cleared his throat, unsure of what to say. "You're safe here," he said gently. "No one will harm you in this house." For the first time, the woman lifted her eyes. They were filled with unshed tears, but also with a faint flicker of hope. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her eyes said more than words ever could. The man brought her a small bowl of warm food. She hesitated before taking it, as if used to kindness, but finally accepted. She ate slowly, quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she held the spoon. The boy watched her closely, his young mind trying to understand who she was and why she had come into their lives. The rest of the day passed in silence, but it was a different silence than before. It wasn't just emptiness. It was the silence of something new beginning. The man could feel it. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that whatever journey they were about to walk, they would walk it together. That night, as he tucked his son into bed, the boy asked softly, "Papa, will she stay with us?" The man paused, his heart heavy yet hopeful. "If she wants to," he whispered back. And in the corner of the room, the woman sat quietly, listening, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the candle. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she could belong. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the same way as before. The silence in the house no longer felt like emptiness. It was more like waiting for something to take shape. The woman moved carefully, always with her head lowered, as though afraid to take up space. She did not speak, but her presence filled the small home in a way neither the man nor his son could ignore. The boy, with the natural curiosity of a child, began watching her closely. At first, he kept his distance, peeking from behind his father's chair or standing in the doorway when she moved about. But soon, his young heart couldn't help itself. One morning, as she swept the floor with slow, unsure movements, he crept closer and placed a small toy carved from wood at her feet. She paused, her hand stilling. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. Then, with trembling fingers, she picked up the little figure and held it gently, as if it were made of glass. Her lips parted slightly, and though no words came out, her eyes softened. The boy smiled at her, the kind of smile that only a child could give, simple, honest, and full of trust. The man watched quietly from a corner. It touched him more than he could explain. For weeks, His son had known only the companionship of his father. Now he was reaching out to someone new, and that meant something was shifting. One evening, the man prepared supper as usual. He placed a plate in front of his son, and then, hesitating, he set one in front of the woman too. She looked at him uncertainly, as though waiting to see if it was truly meant for her. He nodded gently. "It's for you. Please eat." She lowered her eyes and whispered the first word he had ever heard from her lips. It was only one word, so soft he almost missed it. "Thank you." His heart clenched at the sound. Her voice was fragile, quiet, but it carried a weight of gratitude that words alone could never hold. That night, after the meal, she stayed by the fire a little longer than usual. She held the wooden toy the boy had given her and traced its edges with her fingers. The boy leaned against her arm, his head heavy with sleep. She did not push him away. For the first time, she allowed herself to sit still and feel a little less alone. The man lay awake long after his son had fallen asleep. He kept thinking about that single word, "Thank you." It echoed in his mind, carrying with it a promise of something more. Perhaps this woman, who had come into their lives covered in silence, could bring a kind of healing none of them had expected. The next morning, she surprised him again. Without being asked, she began helping with the chores. She gathered water, mended a torn shirt, and even hummed softly as she worked. The tune was faint, like a memory, but it filled the room with a strange comfort. The boy sat near her, listening, his eyes wide with wonder. The man said nothing, but inside, he felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. As the days turned into weeks, the woman slowly began to find her place in the home. At first, her steps were uncertain, as if she expected to be sent away at any moment. But the man never raised his voice, and the boy never stopped looking at her with wide, curious eyes. Slowly, the walls around her began to soften. She started to join them at the table without hesitation. She cooked small meals with the few things they had, showing a quiet care that surprised the man. When the boy scraped his knee one afternoon, she was the first to kneel beside him. She tore a piece of cloth and tied it gently, whispering soothing words in her own tongue. The boy looked up at her with trust shining in his eyes, and for the first time since his mother's passing, he felt that same comforting presence he had missed. The man stood back, watching, his heart caught between relief and awe. He realized he had not just brought someone into the house, he had brought in a chance for healing. But still, there was a question that hung heavy in his mind. Who was she really? What life had she known before this? She had said almost nothing since arriving. Sometimes he would catch her staring out the window, her eyes far away, as though she were listening to voices from another world. One evening, after supper, the man finally gathered the courage to speak. The boy had already fallen asleep, curled up with his little wooden toy in his hands. The room was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of the fire. "You don't have to tell me," the man said gently, "but I want you to know, I don't see you as something bought. You're free here. This home is yours if you want it." For a moment, she didn't move. Her hands tightened around the fabric of her dress, her shoulders rising and falling with her breath. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but there was also a light in them, faint but real. "I thought I would never be seen again," she whispered, her voice low and trembling. The man's chest tightened at her words. He didn't push her for more. He didn't need to. The pain in her tone spoke volumes, and he knew that whatever she had endured, it had taken strength just to survive. That night, something changed. She was no longer just a shadow sitting in a corner of their home. She was a person with a story, a person who had finally begun to believe she could be safe. In the days that followed, her bond with the boy grew stronger. She showed him little things, how to weave thin strands of grass into shapes, how to listen to the wind and guess if rain was coming. The boy laughed more, his voice filling the house with a joy that had long been missing. The man found himself listening too, realizing that she was teaching not just his son, but him as well, teaching them both how to feel alive again. For the first time in years, the man caught himself smiling without forcing it. And when he looked at her, he no longer saw a stranger who had been brought into his home. He saw someone who carried both sorrow and strength, someone who was slowly weaving herself into the fabric of their lives. The change in the house was gentle, but it was clear. Where once there had been silence, there was now the sound of small laughter, quiet conversations, and the rhythm of daily life shared together. The woman no longer sat in the corner with lowered eyes. She moved with purpose, helping in the kitchen, tending to the fire, and guiding the boy with patient care. The boy adored her. Every day he followed her steps, asking questions, showing her little treasures he found outside, and listening wide-eyed when she shared stories. Sometimes her words were broken, spoken in bits of English mixed with her own language, but it didn't matter. The boy understood her heart, and that was enough. One afternoon, the three of them sat by the river. The man had taken a break from his work, and the boy was skipping small stones across the water. The woman sat nearby, weaving strands of grass into a little figure, her hands moving skillfully. She placed the finished piece into the boy's hands, and his face lit up. The man watched them quietly. It was in moments like these that he realized how much had changed. His son, once so quiet and withdrawn, now laughed freely. The woman, once hidden under a sack and silent with fear, now smiled softly as the boy played at her side. And he himself, once burdened by loneliness, felt a strange sense of peace he hadn't known in years. That night, as the fire crackled, the woman hummed a tune while the boy drifted to sleep on her lap. The man sat across from them, listening. The melody was soft and full of longing, yet it carried comfort. It wrapped around the room, filling it with warmth. For a long while he just sat still, afraid to break the spell of that moment. Later, when the boy was tucked in bed, the man spoke again. "I never expected this," he said quietly. "When I first brought you here, I was afraid I had made a mistake. But now I see it was no mistake at all." The woman looked at him, her eyes soft, and for the first time she smiled fully. Not just a small, cautious smile, but one that showed her heart was beginning to heal. From that day forward, the bond between them deepened. She became more than a guest, more than someone who simply stayed under their roof. She became part of the home itself. The boy began calling for her when he needed comfort, and the man found himself seeking her presence when the weight of the day grew heavy. It wasn't spoken aloud, but all three of them felt it, the beginning of something like family. Seasons passed, and with them, the home changed even more. What had once been a place of silence and loss became filled with life again. The boy grew stronger and happier, running through the fields with laughter that carried on the wind. The woman, once hidden and afraid, now walked with her head held high, her steps steady and full of quiet confidence. The man often watched them from a distance. There were times he still wondered how a single dollar could have brought such a change. It had not been money that built this family, but the courage to see beyond fear and the choice to offer kindness where there had been none before. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with gold, the three of them sat outside the small house. The boy rested between them, leaning against the woman's arm while she smoothed his hair. The man sat beside them, his eyes following the horizon, his heart strangely full. The boy looked up with his innocent smile and asked, "Papa, we are a family now, aren't we?" The man's throat tightened. He looked at the woman, and she met his gaze. There was no need for words between them. The answer was already clear in their hearts. "Yes," the man whispered, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We are a family." The boy's smile grew wide, and he nestled closer, safe and content. The woman lowered her head for a moment, and when she lifted it again, her eyes shone with quiet tears. But they were not tears of sorrow this time. They were tears of belonging. In that moment, the past no longer held them captive. The man was no longer just a lonely father. The boy was no longer just a child without a mother. And the woman was no longer someone hidden behind a sack, forgotten and unseen. Together, they had built something new. A home, a family, a place where wounds could heal and love could grow again. And so, under the fading light of the setting sun, 3 lives that had once been broken came together as one, proving that even the smallest chance, just a single coin, just a single act of faith, can change everything.